Let me bring in our team of reporters to cover all this news. Vaughn Hillyard is in West Palm Beach covering the Trump transition. Ryan Nobles is on Capitol Hill, and Ken Dilanian has the latest reaction from the Justice Department. So, Vaughn, I want to start with you. President-elect Trump thanked Gaetz on social media, but I wonder, was there an effort by Trump or the team to encourage Gaetz to do this, to withdraw from the nomination? And I wonder what this reporting of a second alleged encounter with this minor at that 2017 party, if that pushed this over the edge, changed the dynamic of things, Vaughn.
Right. It's not clear if that allegation of that second sexual encounter ultimately spurred Gaetz to back out or not, or whether it was the potential acknowledgement that there were multiple senators who were going to ultimately block his bid for the nomination. Was that the last pin for him to drop, in a realization that it was going to be not a fruitful 2 months ahead for him before those confirmation hearings and proceedings were to move forward? Look, for Matt Gaetz, this is, of course, was going to be an opportunity to be the lead prosecutor for the Department of Justice, a big career opportunity, you could make the case, and somebody who has been no more staunch political ally to Donald Trump than really anybody else up on Capitol Hill. But this is even a greater defeat for Donald Trump, the president-elect. It showed that there was at least part of the Senate that was willing to block his top pick for a very significant position. And for him, this is a moment in time where we are still, again, 2 months out from Inauguration Day, and still plenty of other controversial picks, from Tulsi Gabbard to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to Pete Hegseth, who he has put forward here over the last days, and are going to face that same level of scrutiny and challenges up on Capitol Hill.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about the fact that this is sort of a defeat for President-elect Trump, I wonder, where does the search go from here when it comes to getting a new AG, someone who's going to be as loyal as Gaetz? And I also wonder, because the president-elect said that Gaetz has a, quote, wonderful future ahead, could we see Gaetz go somewhere else in this Trump administration that maybe doesn't require a Senate confirmation?
There's hundreds and thousands of other political appointee positions that do not require a Senate confirmation. So he very well could wind up either at the Department of Justice or at the White House or in some other department or agency. But I think for Donald Trump, this is the difficulty here compared to 8 years ago, when he was looking this go around to fill his cabinet and top administration posts. He made it very clear that he wanted to ensure that loyal individuals who would carry out his agenda, whether it be at the DOJ or at the Pentagon or at at Health and Human Services, that he was going to have people that he could rely on in these roles. And naturally, when that is a commitment that you want these individuals who you're going to nominate to make to you, that pool of individuals becomes even smaller. And so, of course, he put forward Todd Blanche to be his deputy attorney general, and he could very well be alternatively picked to be the AG. But you also have people like Mark Paoletta, who is an attorney who has been helping out this transition process, who is not as well publicly known, may not be outwardly as bombastic, yet could also carry out the idea that the Department of Justice under a Donald Trump presidency shouldn't be this independent entity from the executive branch of the White House here. And so I think for Donald Trump, of course, it is not clear exactly who his alternative is at this time, yet we know that there is no reason to believe that he will not pick somebody who he deems to be almost just as loyal and ready to carry out this idea that they want to take out the deep state, so he calls it, inside of the Department of Justice, and somebody who is willing to take on his perceived enemies through potential investigations.
Yeah, and he has a number of other people to choose from. Now, Ryan, I saw you in the video. You were chasing lawmakers today, as you always do so well. What was the reaction to this Gaetz withdrawal on Capitol Hill, and were lawmakers surprised?
Surprised, I think, Yamisha, is a bit of an understatement. It seemed to catch everybody in this building off guard. In many ways, it seemed as though a bomb was dropped here, especially because the Trump transition seems so intent on trying to find a path to confirmation for Matt Gaetz. And Matt Gaetz seemed so positive when he left here last night about the round of meetings that he had with these senators. But listen to how they responded when, in many ways, we informed them of the news that Gaetz was no longer the nominee.
I'm surprised. At this point, I think Matt's smart. He would change the way the DOJ had done it. I think what Matt decided to do here was
was a decision he had to come to, and it was probably a positive decision for the administration.
What I think it probably reflects is the meetings that he had yesterday with senators. I think that he has put country first, and I'm pleased with his decision.
And what we're hearing, my colleague Julie Sirkin and myself and others, is that he was basically in a position where the math just was not adding up. There was far more than just the 4 senators that he could potentially lose in a confirmation vote that were not willing to vote yes for his appointment as the next attorney general. And despite the fact that he had made this outreach, that the president-elect himself had made that outreach, that the vice president-elect J.D. Vance was here with him to try and make that outreach, that many of these members were just immovable forces. They just could not see their way to voting yes for Matt Gaetz. And Yamiche, I do have to say, I think it is an indication of just what type of Republican Senate we may be dealing with here in this new Congress. This was something that Donald Trump wanted, and at least at this stage, they were telling him no, which is an indication they may be willing to say no to him in the future as well.
Yeah, definitely a window into the dynamics. Now, when I heard this news, I had this thought that sounded wild in my own head, but then we talked to the team here, and other people had that same question, which is Matt Gaetz, Ryan, has already resigned from Congress. He said he doesn't intend to serve his next term, though he was reelected. But can he unresign, Ryan?
So I've been asking this question myself. You were not, it was not ridiculous that you posed that question, Yamiche. I think many people are asking that. I was in contact with his team today, and they told me that he is not even thinking about the next stage of his life, that he's, still dealing with the fact that this nomination quest has come to an end, and he's still evaluating what steps are remaining. But he made it pretty clear in his statement to the Speaker in his letter of resignation that he did not intend on being seated in the next Congress. I don't think there's not a legal reason why he couldn't change his mind. And if he changed his mind up until the date of the swearing in, where he could theoretically be seated. But I do think the practical possibility of that is very small. You have to remember, one of the big reasons he left Congress was because of this looming ethics report. And the only reason that did not see the light of day was because he resigned Congress. If he decided to be sworn back in, that investigation would fire right back up again. And there's a very good chance, even if he's not the potential attorney general nominee, that we'd see that report come to light.
Really important to mention that report. Vaughn, of course, all of this comes as J.D. Vance was literally back on Capitol Hill again with yet another polarizing pick, trying to get support for that. This, of course, being Pete Hegseth. Does Matt Gaetz withdrawing cause more problems for someone like Pete Hegseth or maybe even Tulsi Gabbard, or does it pave the way for their confirmations?
I actually think, to Ryan's point exactly, is that it shows a willingness among some of these Republican senators to buck Donald Trump's wishes, and that they're going to truly carry out the advise and consent role that constitutionally the Senate has been obligated to play. And that's where, for Pete Hegseth, his visit to Capitol Hill is so prudent, because there are reasons in which these Republican senators, including a great many of them that are going to be outgoing in just a few years' time, some of them also, like Bill Cassidy and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, they actually voted to convict Donald Trump after January 6th. So they've already been on the side of Donald Trump's ire. And so there's really, at this point in time, especially with the fact that Donald Trump most likely would not be running for president again 4 years from now, they have, political capital themselves in which they are able to put some handcuffs potentially on who Donald Trump is placing. Because like in the likes of Pete Hegseth, who is facing the serious allegation of a sexual assault from 2017, there is also questions, though, about him. He served as, yes, a decorated combat veteran, but he's never led one of the branches of the military or had a leadership role in the Pentagon. And so I think that this is only draws more attention to people like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK, and the extent to which they will need to convince these particularly Republican senators that they are worthy of confirmation.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much to Vaughn and to Ryan for all that great reporting. And Ken, you've been patiently standing by because you are, of course, covering the building where people were waiting to see what happened here. So there was a lot of concern at the DOJ about this choice for Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. What's been the reaction to the Justice Department today's news? And is there a sort of sense of relief here?
100%, Yamish. We are getting messages expressing incredible relief. This is a great weight off the shoulders of many people over there. They were absolutely horrified by this pick, in part because the Justice Department had investigated Gaetz. There were actually prosecutors over there who built that investigative file filled with damaging information about Matt Gaetz, and they were facing the prospect that he would be their boss. And there's a whole unit that investigates sex trafficking of minors. It just was mind-boggling. But then you leave all that aside and you get the fact that he had never really practiced much law, had never had a job even remotely similar to running a large bureaucracy. The Attorney General is not only the top legal officer, he or she is a very important national security figure, receiving very sensitive intelligence that the president gets. So they are really relieved, but they're also very concerned now about what comes next. And we're really at a crossroads here because Donald Trump has elevated his defense lawyer, Todd Blanche, to be the deputy attorney general, which is really an important job. It's like the chief operating officer. And Todd Blanche, while he did defend Donald Trump and he criticized the special counsel investigations, he is well regarded inside the building. He worked there. He was a prosecutor in the Southern District. He's a real lawyer. And he doesn't believe the nutty conspiracy theories that hold that the FBI, somehow corruptly framed Donald Trump. He knows that's not true. So the question is, will Donald Trump appoint someone who thinks like Todd Blanche or someone who thinks like Matt Gaetz? And there's been some names floating around that run the gamut. A guy named Mike Davis, who's advising the transition team, tweeted today, and he offered some names, one of which is Mark Paoletta, who does seem more in the Gaetz camp. And then there's a guy named Chris Landau, who is the ambassador to Mexico in the Trump administration, who went to Harvard, is at a mainstream law firm, and who seems more like he's in the Todd Blanche camp. So that's the big question right now. DOJ officials very concerned about what comes next here and what it says about the direction the Trump administration wants to take the Justice Department.
Yeah, so even though Matt Gaetz is gone, there's a lot of bracing for what might come next, maybe even some horror that might come next if they're worried about the next pick. Well, thank you so much, Ken, for all your reporting.
You bet.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.